Imagine surviving the trenches of World War I. The artillery, the gas, the mud, the machine guns, only to come home and die from the flu. Not a bomb, not a bullet. A fever, a cough, lungs filling with fluid. Between 1918 and 1919, a virus swept across the planet and killed at least 50 million people worldwide, with some estimates going even higher. About 500 million people, roughly 1/3 of the world's population at the time, were infected. In the United States alone, the death toll was about 675,000. And in just a few months, this pandemic killed more people than World War I killed in 4 years. This was the 1918 flu pandemic, often called the Spanish flu, though that name is misleading. And what made it especially terrifying was not just how many people it killed, but who it killed. Because unlike normal flu seasons, this one went after the young, the strong, the healthy, people in the prime of their lives. By 1918, the world was already exhausted. World War I had turned Europe into a graveyard of trenches and shattered cities. Millions of soldiers were packed into camps, ships, hospitals, and front lines. Men were moving across continents by the hundreds of thousands. Sanitation was poor. Nutrition was uneven. Stress was extreme. And all of that created the perfect highway for disease. In the United States, one of the earliest recognized outbreaks appeared in March 1918 at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, where more than 100 soldiers were reported sick. From there, the disease traveled with troops across the Atlantic and beyond. And that's what makes this story so haunting. The pandemic didn't arrive in a peaceful world with time to prepare. It exploded into a world already in chaos. Picture a match dropped into dry grass, except this grass stretched across the whole planet. First, let's clear up one of the biggest myths. It's called the Spanish flu. But Spain was probably not where it originated. In fact, there is still no universal agreement on the exact geographic origin of the virus. What is clear is that Spain, unlike many nations fighting in World War I, had a freer press. Countries at war often censored bad news to protect morale, but Spain reported openly on the outbreak, including the illness of its king. That visibility helped create the false impression that Spain was the center of the disaster. So the name stuck, and that matters, because names can distort history. Spain didn't cause the pandemic. It was just one of the few countries telling the truth about it. That detail feels modern, doesn't it? A global crisis made worse not only by disease, but by confusion, silence, and bad information. The 1918 pandemic came in 3 waves. The first wave in the spring of 1918 was serious, but many cases looked more like an aggressive seasonal flu. Then the virus came back. And when it returned in late 1918, it was devastating. The second wave hit with brutal speed. In the United States, October 1918 alone killed an estimated 195,000 Americans. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors and nurses got sick themselves. In many places, there weren't enough coffins, enough grave diggers, or enough healthy people left to care for the dying. Families would wake up with one person sick, and by evening, another relative was dead. The disease could move with terrifying force, progressing from fever and exhaustion to severe pneumonia and suffocation. And there was a cruel medical reality behind all of this. No vaccine, no antiviral drugs, no antibiotics for secondary infections. Once the virus and the pneumonia that followed got deep into a community, doctors had very few weapons, and the virus knew it. What truly made the 1918 flu feel unnatural was its age pattern. Seasonal influenza usually hits the very young, the elderly, and people already weakened by illness the hardest. But the 1918 pandemic had an unusually high death rate in healthy adults, aged 20 to 40, while also hitting children and older adults hard. Think about that. This was the age group expected to endure. The workers, the soldiers, the parents of young children, the people society depends on. It would be like a storm that ignores weak buildings and smashes the strongest ones first. Researchers still debate exactly why this happened, and some of the virus's deadliest features are still not fully understood. But we do know it was an H1N1 influenza A virus with genes of avian origin, and its lethality stunned medical science. So imagine the psychological effect in 1918. You're not just afraid for your grandparents. You're afraid for your husband, your brother, your 28-year-old neighbor, the school teacher down the street, the soldier who just came home alive from France. That kind of fear changes how a society breathes. The pandemic was deadly on its own. War made it worse. Troop ships carried infected men across oceans. Crowded barracks and military hospitals created ideal conditions for transmission. Public health systems were strained by wartime demands. And censorship in some countries meant officials and newspapers often downplayed the danger. That's why the phrase, "deadlier than World War I," is not just dramatic, it's historically meaningful. World War I killed millions through years of combat. The 1918 flu killed at least 50 million people in an astonishingly compressed period, spreading into nearly every inhabited part of the world. And unlike artillery or front lines, the flu did not stay on the battlefield. It traveled home, into kitchens, schools, churches, streetcars, funeral parlors. War had geography, the flu had the planet. Now here's one of the most gripping parts of the story, because it shows that even in 1918, human decisions mattered. Researchers studying U.S. cities during the pandemic found that early, sustained, layered public health measures were associated with better outcomes. The classic comparison is Philadelphia versus St. Louis. Philadelphia was slow to react, and after a massive Liberty Loan parade in late September 1918, cases surged catastrophically. St. Louis moved faster. It shut down public gatherings sooner and layered interventions more aggressively. The result was not magic. People still died. But the city's outbreak curve was less explosive than Philadelphia's. That contrast became one of the best-known historical examples of what we now casually call flattening the curve. That part of the story is important because it pushes back against fatalism. The virus was powerful, but response still mattered. Not perfectly, not always enough, but enough to mean the difference between a city being hit hard and a city being hit even harder. And if that sounds familiar, that's because pandemics keep teaching the same lesson. Speed matters. Honesty matters. Public trust matters. Now let's put the scale into perspective. An estimated 500 million people were infected, about 1/3 of the world's population at the time. Global deaths were at least 50 million, and some scholars place the total even higher. In the United States, around 675,000 people died. At the time, the world population was far smaller than it is now. So this wasn't just a large tragedy. It was a civilization-shaking event. Schools closed. Public gatherings were canceled. Businesses struggled. Healthcare systems bent under unbearable strain. And in some communities, especially remote and vulnerable populations, the damage was catastrophic. This was not a bad flu season. It was a global trauma, one that many people today barely remember compared to the war that framed it. And maybe that's because wars come with monuments. Pandemics often leave silence. So why does the 1918 flu pandemic still matter? Because it reveals something unsettling about human history. Sometimes the deadliest threat isn't the one we can see. Not the army on the horizon. Not the explosion in the distance. But the invisible thing moving quietly through crowds, trains, ships, and homes. The 1918 flu pandemic was caused by an H1N1 virus, spread in part by a world at war, intensified by crowding and global movement, and made more lethal by the lack of vaccines, and antibiotics, and modern critical care. It killed more people than World War I, struck with terrifying force in 3 waves, and even targeted people in the prime of life. And maybe the most chilling part is this. The world that faced it was not ignorant. Doctors worked tirelessly. Cities tried different responses. Scientists searched for answers. But the virus moved faster than the systems built to contain it. That's what makes the story feel so modern. Because in every era, people believe catastrophe will look obvious when it comes. And often, it doesn't. Sometimes it arrives as a cough,